"Excuse me, you're in my seat, Zara," Reynolds said firmly, holding out her first-class boarding pass. The middle-aged white businessman didn't even look up from his phone. "No, little girl," he muttered dismissively. "You must be confused. This is my seat." The plane jolted violently as the captain's voice cut through the cabin with chilling finality. "This aircraft is returning to the gate. Security will be boarding." 11-year-old Zara Reynolds felt every eye on the plane turn toward her. A sea of strangers suddenly united in their judgment. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes as she stood frozen in the aisle. The boarding pass clutched in her trembling hand clearly showed seat 4A. Her seat now occupied by the scowling middle-aged man who refused to make eye contact with anyone but the flight attendant. "I paid for first class," the man insisted through clenched teeth, "and I'm not giving up my seat to accommodate some disruption." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Zara's father, Solomon Reynolds, stood protectively beside his daughter, his normally composed demeanor now a barely contained storm. "My daughter's seat," he said with deliberate calm that belied the tension in his shoulders, "was purchased weeks ago. She has the boarding pass to prove it." The flight attendant looked between them. Conflict etched across her face as a ripple of whispers traveled through the cabin. In this moment of heightened tension, with all eyes on the confrontation unfolding in first class, no one realized that this mundane dispute would escalate into a situation that would change lives forever and expose truths that some passengers had spent lifetimes trying to hide. What no one yet realized was that Zara Reynolds wasn't just any passenger. She was the daughter of a billionaire whose influence could ground every plane in the airline's fleet. And she was about to make a call that would change everything. The alarm chirped softly at 5:00 a.m., though Zara was already awake. Sleep had proven elusive as it often did before big meetings. Her bedroom in the Reynolds Chicago penthouse looked like any other child's at first glance, stuffed animals arranged carefully on a window seat. Science fair ribbons pinned to a corkboard, a bookshelf overflowing with dog-eared paperbacks. But the sleek computer setup in the corner told a different story. 3 monitors displayed scrolling code financial projections and the latest user statistics for Edu Empowerment, the educational platform that Zara had created when she was 9, now used in schools across 37 countries. Big day, Sparrow Solomon Reynolds appeared in the doorway, 2 steaming mugs in hand. The childhood nickname still fit her somehow, this small, quick-minded girl whose soar was higher than anyone expected. Zara accepted the hot chocolate gratefully. Nervous Solomon asked, studying his daughter's face. At 43, he'd learned to read the subtle signs of her anxiety, the way she tucked her hair behind her ears repeatedly, the slight furrow between her brows. "The Suncrest investors are old-school," Zara admitted. "They expect someone different. They expect someone who doesn't look like me," she clarified, meeting her father's eyes directly. This was their unspoken understanding, the reality they navigated daily in the worlds of tech and finance. A black girl from Chicago wasn't exactly what popped into people's heads when they heard tech prodigy. "Then today's the day their heads get rewired," Solomon said simply. A former software engineer who'd built Reynolds Technologies from his apartment into a global powerhouse, he'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing he could do was acknowledge the truth without letting it become a barrier. "You're not walking into that room to prove you belong there," he continued. "You're walking in because they need what you've built." Zara nodded, drawing strength from the absolute certainty in her father's voice. In the soft morning light, with her space-themed pajamas and the stuffed penguin she'd had since she was 3, she looked like any other kid. Few would guess that the algorithm she'd developed had revolutionized how children with learning differences interacted with educational material, or that her company's valuation had crossed the billion-dollar threshold 6 months ago. As she sipped her hot chocolate, Zara's thoughts drifted to her mother. Catherine Reynolds had been gone for 3 years now, cancer taking her swiftly and without mercy. but her lessons remained. "Your dignity isn't something others can take," she'd told Zara once after a particularly difficult day at school. "It's something you hold inside regardless of how others see you." Solomon seemed to sense where her thoughts had wandered. "Mom would be so proud of you today," he said softly. Zara smiled, though there was a shadow behind it. "I still miss her at the big moments. Me too, Sparrow. Every day." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "But we carry her with us in everything we do, especially when we stand tall in rooms where others think we shouldn't be." He glanced at his watch. "Speaking of which, we should get moving. San Francisco awaits." As Zara showered and dressed, she mentally rehearsed her presentation. Edu-empowerment wasn't just another ed-tech platform. It was a revolutionary approach that adapted to different learning styles in real time. More importantly, it was being offered free to underfunded schools, with costs subsidized by premium subscriptions from private institutions. It was her mother's legacy as much as her own creation. Catherine had been an elementary school teacher in Chicago's South Side before her marriage to Solomon. She'd seen firsthand how the education system failed many children, particularly those of color. Zara selected her outfit carefully, a navy blue blazer over a simple white blouse paired with tailored pants. Professional, but age-appropriate. The diamond stud earrings her father had given her for her 10th birthday. Small, elegant, meaningful. Catherine's watch too big for her wrist, but kept as close as possible to her heart. Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with early morning travelers. The Reynolds moved efficiently through security, a well-practiced routine from frequent business travel. Zara's passport showed stamps from Tokyo, London, Singapore, evidence of pitches, conferences, and partnership meetings that had taken her around the world. Today's meeting with Suncrest Ventures could mean expanding Edu-empowerment's reach to underserved communities globally, a mission that made the exhausting travel schedule worthwhile. "Dad, did you remember to pack my presentation drive?" Zara asked suddenly, pausing in the middle of the terminal. Solomon patted his breast pocket with a knowing smile. "Right here. Plus the backup in my carry-on and another uploaded to the cloud. Triple redundancy, just like you taught me." This small exchange, the child reminding the parent, reassuring, captured the unique dynamic between them. Their roles often shifted and blended. Sometimes Solomon was the protective father, sometimes he was the supportive executive to Zara's visionary CEO. They'd learned to dance between these identities seamlessly, each filling in the gaps for the other. Isabella Morales, Solomon's executive assistant, met them at the gate with coffee for Solomon and a fruit smoothie for Zara. At 35, Isabella had been with Reynolds Technologies for 8 years and was one of the few people who treated Zara as neither a child nor a prodigy, but simply as herself. "The Suncrest team confirmed they'll meet us at the hotel before heading to the conference," Isabella reported. "Your presentation is slotted for 2 p.m., which gives us plenty of time for any last-minute adjustments." "Thanks, Isabella," Zara said, taking a sip of her smoothie. "Will you be sitting with us on the plane?" Isabella shook her head. "I'm in economy today. The first-class cabin was fully booked except for your seat." Solomon frowned slightly. "I thought we had adjacent seats." "There was a last-minute change," Isabella explained. "The airline apologized, but with the conference, every flight to San Francisco is packed." Zara caught the flicker of concern in her father's eyes. "I'll be fine, Dad. It's a 3-hour flight. What could happen?" As they queued for boarding, Zara became aware of glances thrown her way, some curious, some dismissive. She'd grown accustomed to being the only child in business settings, the only black person in many rooms, often the only female voice in discussions. Still, it never stopped stinging slightly. "Now boarding Group A for Flight 789 to San Francisco." The announcement crackled over the speakers. Solomon gathered their things as Zara tucked her tablet into her backpack. "Ready, Sparrow?" He asked the question layered with meaning, beyond just the boarding call. Zara took a deep breath, squared her shoulders beneath her neat blazer, and nodded. Ready. They joined the line, boarding passes in hand. Zara's ticket showed seat 4A, a window seat in first class. Though Solomon could easily afford first-class tickets for both of them, he'd deliberately booked himself in economy. You need to learn to navigate these spaces on your own, he'd explained when they'd started this arrangement a year ago. I can't always be there to smooth the way. As they reached the front of the line, Zara heard a snippet of conversation from a middle-aged couple behind them. First class is becoming a daycare center, the man muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. Parents these days have no limits. Zara felt her father stiffen beside her, but gave a small shake of her head. Some battles weren't worth fighting. She'd learned to pick her moments carefully. See you in San Francisco, Solomon said, as they reached the split in the jet bridge. He hugged her quickly, whispering, Remember who you are. Zara nodded, shouldered her backpack, and walked toward the first-class cabin, with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she was going. Richard Whitfield was having a terrible day. It had started with his alarm failing to go off, continued with a traffic jam that made him miss his original flight, and now culminated in a middle seat in economy on the only available flight to San Francisco, a flight he absolutely had to be on. The quarterly investors' meeting for Whitfield Financial started at 4 p.m., and as Vice President of Strategic Development, his absence would be noticed and judged, especially by CEO Marcus Townsend, who had made it increasingly clear that the old guard at Whitfield Financial needed to adapt or step aside. Richard's phone buzzed with another message from Townsend. Confirm when you land. Reynolds Technologies presentation cannot be missed. Richard grimaced. Reynolds Technologies. The very name made his stomach clench. 5 years ago, Solomon Reynolds had been just another tech startup founder with big ideas. Now he was a billionaire whose company had revolutionized financial software, making traditional firms like Whitfield Financial seem increasingly obsolete. And tomorrow they would have to listen politely while Reynolds pitched his newest innovation, pretending they weren't terrified of being left behind in the digital revolution. Richard tugged at his tie, feeling strangled by more than just the fabric. At 55, he'd spent his entire career building a reputation in traditional finance. He'd played by the rules, climbed the ladder rung by methodical rung. And now people like Reynolds, people who broke rules, who didn't respect the established order, were rendering all of that irrelevant. Final boarding call for Flight 789 to San Francisco. The announcement jolted him from his thoughts. He rushed to the gate, arriving breathless only to be greeted by a gate agent's tight smile. Mr. Whitfield, we've been paging you. We were about to release your seat. I'm here now, Richard said tersely. The gate agent tapped at her keyboard, then looked up with unexpected brightness. It seems your luck is changing, sir. We have an equipment change and there's been a seating adjustment. You've been moved to first-class seat 4D. Richard's mood lifted instantly. Perhaps the day was turning around. First class meant a decent meal space to prepare for the meeting, and most importantly, the status he deserved. He took the new boarding pass with something approaching a smile. Thank you. At least something's going right today. As he walked down the jet bridge, Richard straightened his posture and adjusted his tie. First class was where he belonged, where he'd earned the right to be through decades of hard work and dedication. These tech upstarts might be flying high now, but Richard believed in the natural order of things. Sooner or later, balance would be restored. He had no way of knowing that his decision to board this particular flight, to accept this particular seat upgrade, would set in motion events that would challenge everything he believed about himself and the world he thought he understood. The first-class cabin of Flight 789 gleamed with the muted luxury of leather seats and extra leg room. Zara moved confidently toward seat 4A, her small carry-on rolling behind her. She'd flown often enough to navigate the rituals of air travel with ease, where to stow her bag, how to adjust her seat. The polite nods exchanged with flight attendants. From rows back in economy, Solomon watched his daughter settle in a familiar mix of pride and anxiety, stirring within him. Every time Zara stepped away from his protective presence, he felt it that catch in his throat, the silent prayer that the world would see her as he did, brilliant, deserving, and so much more than the sum of others' expectations. Zara stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her, keeping her tablet accessible for the flight. She was reviewing her presentation one last time when she noticed a commotion at the front of the cabin. A middle-aged man in an expensive but slightly rumpled suit was engaged in a heated discussion with a flight attendant. He gestured emphatically at his boarding pass, his face flushed with frustration. The flight attendant nodded apologetically and guided him toward the first-class cabin. As they approached, Zara realized with a jolt that the man was heading directly for her row. She glanced at her own boarding pass again, confirming that she was indeed in the correct seat. The man stopped at her row, looked at the seat number, then at her, his expression shifting from frustration to confusion to something harder to define. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe you're in my seat." Zara looked up calmly. "This is 4A, she said, holding out her boarding pass. "That's what my ticket says." Richard Whitfield barely glanced at the boarding pass she offered. Instead, his eyes performed a rapid assessment, taking in her age. Her race, the simple but clearly expensive clothes, and made a series of assumptions that would prove catastrophic. "There must be some mistake," he said, addressing the flight attendant rather than Zara. "I was specifically upgraded to first class." "Check again." Laura Martinez, the flight attendant, looked uncomfortable. At 40, she'd been with the airline for 15 years and had learned that the quickest way to resolve seating disputes was usually to side with the passenger who seemed to belong in the premium cabin. And despite her own Hispanic heritage, years of conditioning had taught her what belonging looked like in first class. "Let me see your boarding pass, miss," she said to Zara, her tone professionally pleasant, but with an undercurrent of doubt. Zara handed over her boarding pass without comment. Laura examined it, then looked at Richard's ticket. "Mr. Whitfield, your boarding pass shows seat 4D, not 4A, she said, pointing to the seat across the aisle. Richard's frown deepened. "That can't be right. I specifically requested a window seat." "I understand, sir, but according to our records, this young lady has the correct assignment to seat 4A. Richard's gaze finally focused fully on Zara, taking in her composed expression and the quiet confidence in her posture. Something about her demeanor, the lack of intimidation perhaps, seemed to irritate him further. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, but still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I have an important business meeting directly after landing. I need the window seat to work undisturbed. I'm sure the young lady wouldn't mind switching. It's not like she needs the workspace." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. The assumption that her needs, her comfort, her right to the seat she'd purchased were all automatically less important than his. Zara felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but kept her expression neutral. "Actually, I also have an important meeting after landing," she said evenly. "And I specifically booked a window seat because I get motion sickness in aisle seats." This wasn't strictly true, but Zara had learned that sometimes people only respected practical concerns, not principles. Richard's expression darkened. "Surely your parents booked this ticket? Where are they? Perhaps they can explain the situation." The implication was clear. A child couldn't possibly have legitimate business in first class without adult supervision. "My father is in economy," Zara replied. "But I booked my own ticket with my own funds, and I have every right to sit in the seat I purchased." From across the aisle in seat 5C, Elena Garcia watched the interaction with growing concern. As the founder of Garcia Innovations, a successful medical technology company, she recognized the familiar pattern unfolding: the automatic dismissal, the assumptions based on appearance, the refusal to acknowledge someone's rightful place. "Excuse me," Elena interjected, her Spanish accent slight but noticeable. "The young lady has shown her boarding pass. She has the correct seat assignment. Why is this still a discussion?" Richard glanced at Elena with barely concealed irritation at her intervention. "This is between the airline and me," he said tersely. Laura looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitfield, your assigned seat is 4D. It's the aisle seat in this same row." "The young lady does have the correct boarding pass for 4A. "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered, his voice rising again. "I paid for first class. I'm a platinum member with this airline. Are you really going to make me take an aisle seat to accommodate a child?" The word child carried all the dismissal he couldn't express more explicitly in public. Zara remained outwardly calm, though her heart raced. She'd faced this before, the moment when standing her ground turned her from a person into a problem. When her legitimate rights became an inconvenience to be managed, a disruption to be contained. "Mr. Whitfield," Laura said, attempting to maintain her professional composure. "Seat 4D is also a first-class seat. The amenities are identical. If window seating was crucial, our gate agents could have addressed that before boarding." Richard finally seemed to realize he was fighting a losing battle, at least on the specific issue of the seat assignment, but rather than concede gracefully, he did what people with privilege often do when challenged: he shifted the goalposts. "Fine," he said coldly. "I'll take 4D. But I want it noted that I'm extremely dissatisfied with how this situation has been handled." As he stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment with unnecessary force, he muttered just loudly enough to be heard. Standards really have fallen everywhere. The racial undertone was subtle but unmistakable. Elena Garcia's eyes narrowed, and she exchanged a glance with Zara, a moment of silent solidarity between two women of color who recognized exactly what was happening. Laura, eager to diffuse the tension, quickly assisted Richard with settling into seat 4D. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage, sir? Perhaps some water or orange juice?" As the flight attendant attempted to soothe Richard's wounded pride, with extra attention, Zara turned to look out the window, maintaining her composure, even as she felt the eyes of other passengers on her. She'd won this small battle, but experience had taught her that people like Richard Whitfield rarely conceded defeat easily. What she didn't yet realize was how far he would go to reassert the dominance he felt entitled to, or how dramatically this seemingly minor seating dispute would escalate over the next few hours. As the initial confrontation settled into an uneasy truce, the other first-class passengers reacted in ways that reflected their own perspectives and biases. Some busied themselves with books or devices, pretending not to have noticed the dispute. Others exchanged glances or whispered comments, choosing sides without speaking up. In seat 6B, Martin Rivera observed the situation with professional interest. As a commercial pilot for a competing airline currently traveling on his day off, he recognized the familiar dynamics of cabin hierarchy and passenger entitlement. He'd seen flight attendants like Laura before, caught between company policy and the unspoken expectation to defer to certain passengers over others. "Excuse me," Martin said quietly as Laura passed his seat. "That young lady clearly had the correct boarding pass. Why was there even a discussion?" Laura paused, surprised by the direct question. "Sir, we try to accommodate all our passengers' needs," she replied automatically. "Some more than others, it seems." Martin noted his tone neutral, but his implication clear. Laura had the grace to look slightly embarrassed before continuing down the aisle. Across from Martin, in seat 6C, Sophia Williams was pretending to read legal briefs while actually following the drama with keen interest. As a corporate attorney specializing in discrimination cases, she'd developed a radar for situations with potential legal implications. The interaction she'd just witnessed had raised several red flags. James Bradford, a 65-year-old retired banking executive in seat 3F, had watched the entire exchange with a complex mix of emotions. He'd come of age during the civil rights movement, had seen the financial industry slowly and reluctantly diversify over his 4-decade career. The automatic assumption that the black child didn't belong in first class struck uncomfortably close to attitudes he'd worked to overcome in himself. Meanwhile, Richard was making his displeasure known through a series of small but pointed behaviors, sighing heavily as he adjusted his seat, demanding another beverage before takeoff, pointedly ignoring Zara's presence across the aisle. For her part, Zara kept her eyes on her tablet, reviewing her presentation with forced concentration. She was accustomed to being underestimated to the subtle and not-so-subtle ways people communicated that she didn't belong in prestigious spaces. Usually she let these moments roll off her back, picking battles carefully, as her father had taught her. But something about Richard's dismissal had cut deeper than usual. Perhaps it was the accumulated stress of the upcoming presentation, or the absence of her father beside her, or simply the exhaustion of constantly having to prove her right to exist in spaces others took for granted. Elena Garcia noticed the young girl's composed expression and recognized the effort it must be costing her. She'd been in similar situations herself, the only Latina woman in countless boardrooms, constantly having to prove she deserved her seat at the table. "That's an impressive presentation," Elena commented, nodding toward Zara's tablet. Educational technology. Zara looked up surprised and slightly wary of the unexpected conversation. "Yes, it's an adaptive learning platform. I thought I recognized the interface." "Edu-empowerment, correct. My company has been looking at implementing it in our community outreach programs." Zara's expression brightened with genuine interest. "You're familiar with the platform Garcia Innovations? We develop medical technology, but we have a foundation that focuses on education in underserved communities." Elena offered her hand. "Elena Garcia." "Zara Reynolds," Zara replied, shaking Elena's hand with the firm grip her father had taught her. Richard Whitfield's head snapped up at the mention of the Reynolds name. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed quickly by disbelief and then calculation. Elena noticed his reaction and continued her conversation with Zara deliberately. "So you must be Solomon Reynolds' daughter. I've heard impressive things about your work. Aren't you speaking at the Tech Forward conference tomorrow?" "Yes, I'm presenting our new neural adaptive learning module." Zara confirmed her professional confidence, momentarily overriding her awareness of Richard's sudden attention. Several other passengers were now watching the interaction with growing interest. The realization was spreading through the cabin. This wasn't just any child being precocious. This was the heir to Reynolds Technologies, already a recognized innovator in her own right. James Bradford leaned forward slightly. "I saw an article about you in Business Week last month," he commented. "Quite remarkable achievements for someone of any age." Richard's expression had transformed entirely. The dismissive irritation was gone, replaced by the careful, neutral mask of someone recalculating his approach. If this was indeed Solomon Reynolds' daughter, the tech prodigy whose company's valuation had passed $1 billion, his earlier behavior might have significant consequences. Laura, the flight attendant, had also caught the exchange and was now looking at Zara with new awareness and barely concealed anxiety. She'd treated the situation as a routine seating dispute, automatically siding with the older white businessman over the black child. If this was Zara Reynolds, that mistake could have professional repercussions. The cabin dynamic had shifted dramatically. What had been a simple case of passenger entitlement now carried undercurrents of recognition, realization, and for some, the uncomfortable awareness of their own assumptions. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Zara returned to her presentation review, but the atmosphere around her had changed. The whispers had taken on a different tone, not dismissal now, but recognition and reassessment. Martin Rivera observed the shifting dynamic with a cynical half-smile. He'd seen this before, too, how quickly respect materialized when privilege recognized power in unexpected packages. Sophia Williams was discreetly taking notes on her phone. The discrimination had been subtle but unmistakable, and the company's handling of it potentially actionable. As a matter of professional habit, she documented what she'd witnessed, noting time-specific behaviors and responses. Richard Whitfield sat rigidly in his aisle seat, outwardly composed but inwardly seething with a toxic mix of embarrassment, resentment, and calculation. He'd made a potential enemy of Solomon Reynolds' daughter a catastrophic misstep given tomorrow's meeting. But perhaps there was still a way to salvage the situation, to reframe his behavior as a simple misunderstanding rather than what it had actually been, an automatic dismissal based on race and age. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, carrying with it a first-class cabin now charged with unspoken tensions and the seeds of a confrontation that would escalate far beyond a simple seating dispute. 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and Laura Martinez made her way through the first-class cabin to begin drink service. Her movements were precise and professional, but her mind raced with the implications of what she'd learned. Zara Reynolds, the child prodigy whose educational software was revolutionizing classrooms around the world. The daughter of Solomon Reynolds, whose company was not only a tech giant, but also a significant corporate client of the airline with contracts for corporate travel worth millions. And Laura had nearly sided with Richard Whitfield in forcing her out of her rightfully assigned seat. As she arranged glasses on her cart, Laura berated herself for falling into the same trap she'd promised herself she'd avoid. Growing up in a predominantly white suburb, as one of the few Hispanic families, Laura had experienced the sting of assumptions based on appearance. She'd worked twice as hard to prove herself, eventually putting herself through college while working as a flight attendant. Yet here she was, 15 years into her career, automatically deferring to a white businessman over a black child, despite the clear evidence of the boarding passes. The realization made her stomach clench with shame. "Beverage service?" she asked as she reached Zara's seat, working to keep her voice steady and professional. "Water, please," Zara replied without looking up from her tablet. Laura poured the water with special care. "Ice, no thank you." Laura hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I apologize for the confusion earlier, Miss Reynolds. It shouldn't have happened." Zara looked up, then her young face showing a maturity beyond her years. "It happens more often than you might think," she said simply. The lack of accusation in her tone made Laura feel even worse. This child was accustomed to being doubted, to having her presence questioned in spaces where she belonged. "Still, it was unprofessional of me, and I'm sorry," Laura insisted. Across the aisle, Richard cleared his throat pointedly. "When you're finished, I'd like a scotch," he said, his tone making it clear he felt his needs were being neglected in favor of what he considered unnecessary conversation. Laura turned to him with her professional smile firmly in place. "Of course, Mr. Whitfield, I'll be right with you." As she prepared his drink, Laura was acutely aware of the shift in power dynamics in the cabin. What had seemed like a routine flight was now charged with tension, and her own role in the unfolding drama was becoming increasingly complicated. She served Richard his scotch, noticing the calculating look in his eyes as he glanced repeatedly at Zara. Something about his expression made Laura uneasy. There was resentment there, but also something more strategic, as if he were planning his next move. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked. "Information," Richard said quietly, gesturing for her to lean closer. "That child, is she really Solomon Reynolds' daughter?" Laura straightened, uncomfortable with his question and the conspiratorial tone. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other passengers, sir," she replied formally. Richard's expression hardened. "I see. Suddenly, privacy is a concern." The implication was clear. Laura had been willing to question Zara's right to her seat, but was now protecting her identity. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. "Is there anything else I can help you with regarding your flight experience today?" Laura asked, deliberately redirecting to safer professional territory. Richard waved her away dismissively. "That will be all for now. As Laura moved to serve the next row, she noticed Sophia Williams watching the interaction with sharp interest. The woman's legal pad now contained several pages of notes, and her expression suggested professional assessment rather than casual observation. Martin Rivera caught Laura's eye as she reached his row. Handling a delicate situation, he commented quietly as she served his club soda. "Not always easy to know which passengers to prioritize, is it?" The gentle but pointed observation made Laura flush. Everyone deserves equal respect and service. She responded the words feeling hollow even as she said them. In theory, Martin agreed. The practice is often more complicated. Laura continued down the aisle, increasingly aware that this flight was becoming a microcosm of larger societal dynamics, privilege, bias, power, and the ways they intersected in daily interactions. Her own role was no longer simply that of service provider, but participant in an unfolding ethical scenario. As she returned to the galley to prepare the meal service, Laura made a decision. She would be vigilantly attentive to how this situation developed. If Richard Whitfield continued to display hostility toward Zara, she would document it properly and report it to the captain. No more automatic deference, no more assumptions. But Laura had no way of knowing that events were already accelerating beyond her control, and that her next interaction with Richard Whitfield would trigger a sequence of consequences that would affect everyone on board Flight 789. Turbulence hit halfway through the meal service, a sudden patch of rough air that sent the plane dipping and rolling. Drinks-sloshed passengers clutched their armrests, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, advising flight attendants to suspend service and secure themselves. Zara, who had been quietly eating her meal while reviewing her presentation, felt her tablet slide from the tray table. She lunged to catch it, but the movement sent her water glass tipping directly into Richard Whitfield's lap. The cold water soaked his expensive suit pants, causing him to jerk upright, with a curse that was far too loud for the first-class cabin. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, glaring at Zara, as if the turbulence had been her personal doing. "I'm sorry," Zara said immediately, offering her napkin. The turbulence Richard snatched the napkin from her hand. "Watch what you're doing," he snapped, dabbing ineffectually at his soaked pants. "This suit costs more than most people's monthly salary." Several passengers looked up at the commotion. Elena Garcia frowned at Richard's disproportionate reaction to what had clearly been an accident. It was turbulence, Sir Elena pointed out. No one could have prevented that. Richard ignored her, continuing to glare at Zara while attempting to dry his pants. "First my seat, now this," he muttered just loudly enough to be heard. "This is what happens when standards slip." The implication hung in the air that Zara's presence in first class represented some lowering of standards rather than her legitimate right to be there. Zara felt the familiar heat of embarrassment and anger rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composure. "I apologized for the accident," she said calmly. "The turbulence affected everyone equally. Some of us were careful enough to secure our belongings," Richard retorted, gesturing to his own tray table where his laptop had been closed and put away at the first sign of rough air. Laura arrived with extra napkins and a club soda for the stain. "Sir, it was unexpected turbulence," she said, trying to defuse the situation. "These things happen on flights." Richard accepted the napkins without acknowledging Laura's comment. Instead, he continued to focus his irritation on Zara. "Perhaps children shouldn't be seated without adult supervision in premium cabins," he said to no one in particular, but loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It creates unnecessary risks." This was too much for Martin Rivera, who had been watching the interaction with growing concern. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of a pilot, "the young lady has conducted herself with perfect propriety throughout this flight. The spill was clearly caused by turbulence, which the captain warned might occur when we departed. Your suggestion that she doesn't belong in this cabin has no basis in airline policy or common courtesy." Richard turned to Martin with cold eyes. "I don't believe I was speaking to you." You were speaking loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear Sophia Williams interjected from her seat, and making insinuations that could be construed as discriminatory. The atmosphere in this cabin had shifted dramatically. What had been underlying tension was now open confrontation, with passengers taking sides in a dispute that had transcended a simple seating issue or accidental spill. Richard, finding himself suddenly on the defensive, switched tactics. "I merely suggested that all passengers should exercise appropriate caution," he said, his tone smoothing into something more controlled. "Age has nothing to do with it, doesn't it?" Elena challenged. "You specifically mentioned children not belonging in premium cabins without supervision. Yet Miss Reynolds has demonstrated more maturity and composure than many adults I've flown with." Richard's expression tightened. He was unused to being challenged, particularly by women and minorities. In his world, the traditional financial sector where old hierarchies still held sway, his authority was rarely questioned. "I think we can all agree that certain standards of behavior are expected in first class," he said, attempting to reframe the discussion into one about class and propriety, rather than age or race. Indeed, James Bradford spoke up from his seat, his voice carrying the weight of decades in corporate leadership. Standards like basic courtesy, respect for fellow passengers, and accepting responsibility for one's own reactions. Standards that I must say the young lady has exemplified far more consistently than others I could mention. The implied criticism was unmistakable. Richard's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He was losing control of the narrative, finding himself cast as the villain rather than the victim. In a final attempt to reassert dominance, he turned to Laura. "I'd like to speak to the captain," he demanded. "I have concerns about cabin management and passenger safety that need to be addressed." Laura hesitated. Protocol dictated that passenger concerns should be addressed by the cabin crew whenever possible, with the captain involved only for significant safety or security issues. "Sir, if you have specific concerns, I'm happy to—" "The captain," Richard insisted, his voice rising again. "Now, or shall I contact airline headquarters directly?" The implicit threat that he had the influence to cause problems for the crew hung in the air. Laura straightened her spine. "I'll inform the captain of your request," she said professionally. "However, I should advise you that disturbances in the cabin, including aggressive behavior toward crew members or other passengers, are taken very seriously." As Laura moved toward the cockpit, the cabin remained tense with unspoken conflict. Richard sat rigid in his seat, embarrassment and anger radiating from him in almost palpable waves. Zara had returned to her tablet, outwardly composed, but inwardly shaken by the escalation. What no one in the cabin yet realized was that Richard Whitfield's demand to speak with the captain would set in motion a sequence of events that would transform a personal dispute into a much larger confrontation, one that would expose truths about privilege, power, and the consequences of unchecked entitlement. The conflict between Zara and Richard had transformed the first-class cabin from a collection of individual travelers into an audience and, in some cases, participants in an unfolding drama. As Laura disappeared into the cockpit to relay Richard's demand to the captain, the other passengers processed what they had witnessed in ways that reflected their own experiences and perspectives. Zara sat quietly in her window seat, outwardly focused on her tablet, but inwardly reliving a painfully similar incident from her elementary school days. She'd been the only black student selected for the advanced mathematics program, and a parent had openly questioned her placement, suggesting to the principal that diversity considerations might have lowered standards. Her mother had fought that battle fiercely, presenting Zara's test scores and demanding equal treatment. "Never let them see you doubt your right to be exactly where you are," Catherine had told her afterward. "Your dignity isn't up for debate." Remembering her mother's words steadied her now. She discreetly tapped out a text message to her father in economy minor issue in first class. "Handling it, don't worry." Across the aisle, Elena Garcia was making her own assessment of the situation. As the founder of a successful medical technology company, she'd faced similar dismissals throughout her career, The automatic assumption that a Latina woman couldn't possibly be the CEO, must be the assistant or diversity hire. She recognized in Richard Whitfield the same type of man who had patronized her in countless boardrooms. But what concerned her most was the flight attendant's initial handling of the seating dispute. Laura had automatically sided with Richard, despite clear evidence that Zara had the correct seat assignment. That pattern of authority figures enforcing bias rather than policy was all too familiar. Martin Rivera, watching from his seat in row 6, was processing the scene with professional interest as well as personal concern. As a commercial pilot, he'd witnessed countless interactions between flight attendants and passengers, had seen how quickly minor disputes could escalate into security incidents. But as a Hispanic man who had faced skepticism about his qualifications throughout his career, he also recognized the particular sting of being treated as if you didn't belong in spaces you had earned the right to occupy. Sophia Williams was still taking discreet notes on her legal pad. As a civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination cases, she'd developed an instinct for situations with potential legal implications. The airline's handling of this incident, from the initial seating dispute to the current escalation, raised several red flags from a liability perspective. James Bradford, the retired banking executive, was experiencing a more complex emotional response. In his decades on Wall Street, he had been part of a system that had often excluded people who looked like Zara from positions of power and privilege. He had considered himself one of the good ones, not actively racist, occasionally mentoring promising minority candidates. But watching this scene unfold forced him to confront his own complicity in systems that automatically questioned the presence of certain people in prestigious spaces. The turbulence had subsided, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged. Several passengers were now openly watching the drama unfold, some recording discreetly on their phones, others exchanging glances and whispered comments. Laura emerged from the cockpit, her expression professionally neutral, but with an underlying tension. She approached Richard's seat. "Mr. Whitfield, the captain, has asked me to inform you that he's focused on navigating through this weather system at the moment. He suggests that any non-emergency concerns be addressed to the cabin crew, or if necessary to customer service representatives upon landing." Richard's face flushed with indignation. "This is unacceptable. I am a platinum member with this airline. My concerns deserve immediate attention." "The captain's primary responsibility is the safe operation of this aircraft," Laura replied. Her voice steady but firm. "Safety protocols dictate minimal cockpit disturbance during challenging flight conditions." It was a reasonable explanation, but Richard clearly interpreted it as a dismissal. His sense of entitlement to special treatment, to immediate attention, to deference from service personnel had been challenged repeatedly during this flight, and his reaction was becoming increasingly disproportionate. "Perhaps your captain would be more responsive if he understood who was making the request." Richard said, his voice lowered, but intense. "I am the Vice President of Strategic Development at Whitfield Financial. We manage significant investments in your airline's parent company." The implied threat hung in the air that Richard had the influence to cause problems for the crew's careers, for the airline's stock price, for the captain's standing with corporate leadership. Laura maintained her professional composure, though her eyes had hardened slightly. "I'll certainly relay that information to the captain, sir. In the meantime, is there anything I can do to address your concerns?" Richard glanced at Zara, then back at Laura. "Yes. I believe that young ladies' presence in first class without adult supervision constitutes a safety concern. The water spill demonstrates the potential risks. I'd like her moved to economy where her father can properly supervise her." The request was so outrageous, so clearly motivated by personal animus rather than legitimate safety concerns, that Laura actually blinked in surprise. "So Miss Reynolds is a ticketed first-class passenger with a valid boarding pass for her assigned seat. The water spill was caused by unexpected turbulence, which could have happened to any passenger. There are no airline policies requiring minors of her age to be accompanied in premium cabins. Nevertheless, Richard insisted, as a concerned passenger with significant standing in your airline's corporate structure, I am formally requesting that she be relocated for the remainder of the flight. Elena Garcia had heard enough. This is absurd, she said loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Mr. Whitfield is not making a safety request. He is attempting to use corporate influence to remove a young passenger who has done nothing wrong, apparently because he finds her presence offensive, for reasons he hasn't directly articulated, but which seem obvious to everyone in this cabin. Several passengers nodded or murmured in agreement. Richard turned to Elena with cold fury in his eyes. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said dismissively. This is a matter between me and the airline. It became a matter for all of us when you decided to make it public. Martin interjected. And as a commercial pilot, I can assure you there is absolutely no safety justification for what you're suggesting. Richard's face had grown increasingly flushed. He was unused to being challenged, particularly by people he automatically categorized as beneath his notice. Women minorities service personnel. The public nature of this confrontation with multiple passengers now openly siding against him was clearly pushing him beyond his usual carefully maintained corporate facade. This is outrageous, he sputtered. I will be filing formal complaints about this entire situation. Please do, Sophia Williams said calmly from her seat. I'm sure the airline's legal department will be very interested in reviewing the full context of your complaints, including your specific comments about certain passengers not belonging in first class. The implied legal threat hung in the air, further inflaming Richard's sense of being unfairly targeted. In a final desperate attempt to reassert control, he pulled out his phone. Perhaps it's time I made some calls, he said, his voice shaking slightly with suppressed rage. There are people who will be very interested to hear how platinum members are being treated on this airline. Laura stepped forward immediately. Sir, we're still experiencing turbulence and the seatbelt sign is illuminated. FAA regulations prohibit the use of cellular devices during these conditions. Don't be ridiculous, Richard snapped, already dialing. Everyone uses phones on planes. Not during turbulence with the seatbelt sign illuminated, Laura insisted. Sir, I must ask you to put your phone away immediately. But Richard was beyond heeding reasonable requests. The accumulation of perceived slights, the seat reassignment, the water spill, the captain's refusal to meet with him. The other passengers siding against him had pushed him past the point of rational behavior. I'm calling the airline's executive offices, he announced loudly, holding the phone to his ear, despite Laura's increasingly urgent requests to comply with safety regulations. It was this moment Richard's open defiance of crew member instructions during a safety warning that would transform a personal dispute into a genuine security incident, with consequences that would extend far beyond Flight 789. The moment Richard Whitfield raised his phone to his ear in direct violation of flight attendant instructions, a line was crossed. What had been a troubling display of entitlement and bias became something more serious. A security concern that required formal intervention. Laura Martinez's professional demeanor hardened into something more authoritative. Sir, this is my final request. Put your phone away immediately. Failure to comply with crew member instructions is a federal offense. Richard barely glanced at her too, consumed by his determination to reassert control through the exercise of his perceived influence. This will only take a moment, he said dismissively. Laura made a quick hand signal to her colleague Michael Torres, who had been monitoring the situation from the galley. He nodded and immediately headed toward the cockpit to alert the captain of the escalating situation. Meanwhile, Richard was growing increasingly frustrated as his call failed to connect. What's wrong with the signal? He muttered, pulling the phone from his ear to check the screen. There is no signal, Sir, Laura informed him coolly. We're at cruising altitude. Your phone is attempting to connect to towers, which is precisely why its use is prohibited during this phase of flight. Now please power it off and stow it immediately. Richard finally seemed to register the seriousness of Laura's tone and the potential consequences of his actions. Reluctantly, he lowered the phone, but his expression made it clear that his frustration had only increased. "This entire situation is intolerable," he said loudly. "First, I'm forced to sit in an aisle seat despite my status. Then I'm soaked with water by an unsupervised child who shouldn't even be in this cabin. When I attempt to address these legitimate concerns, I'm ignored by the captain and lectured about phone usage. I've never been treated so disrespectfully in all my years of flying." His voice had risen to a level that carried throughout the first-class cabin and beyond. Several passengers in business class were now craning their necks to see what was happening. Zara had remained silent throughout this latest escalation, outwardly composed but inwardly anxious about being the focal point of such a public confrontation. She considered texting her father again, but decided against it. Solomon would almost certainly intervene if he knew how bad the situation had become, and that would only validate Richard's insistence that she needed adult supervision. Instead, she made a decision. Reaching for her own phone, she activated it discreetly under the cover of her tray table. Unlike Richard, she wasn't attempting to make a call, she was activating the recording function, documenting the unfolding situation in case it continued to escalate. Elena Garcia noticed Zara's subtle movement and gave her a small nod of approval. Document everything. It was a lesson every woman and minority learned eventually. When systems failed to protect you, evidence became your most powerful tool. Michael returned from the cockpit, speaking quietly to Laura at the front of the cabin. Their expressions were serious, their body language tense. After a brief conference, Laura approached Richard once more. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice now carrying the formal tone of official procedure rather than customer service. "Captain Torres has been informed of the situation. He has directed me to issue you a formal warning under FAA regulations. Your refusal to comply with crew member instructions regarding electronic devices during turbulence constitutes a violation of safety protocols." Richard stared at her in genuine shock. The idea that he, a platinum member, a corporate vice president, a man accustomed to deference and accommodation, was being formally warned like some common troublemaker seemed inconceivable to him. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "I was attempting to contact customer service about legitimate concerns. Your concerns can be addressed through proper channels upon landing," Laura replied steadily. "At this time, I need your verbal confirmation that you understand this warning and will comply with all crew instructions for the remainder of the flight." The formal nature of the request, essentially requiring Richard to verbally acknowledge his misconduct, was clearly humiliating to him. His face flushed darker, and for a moment it seemed he might escalate further. But the watching eyes of the entire cabin and the unmistakable seriousness of Laura's demeanor finally penetrated his bubble of entitlement. "Fine," he said tersely. "I understand the warning." "Thank you," Laura responded professionally. "Please remain in your seat with your seatbelt fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign." As Laura returned to the galley, Richard sat rigid in his seat, emanating waves of barely contained fury. The public nature of the warning delivered in front of a cabin full of witnesses had struck at the core of his self-image as a man of importance and influence. Zara, who had been recording discreetly, stopped the recording and carefully returned her phone to her pocket. She kept her expression neutral, but a small part of her felt vindicated. For once, someone in authority had enforced the rules, equally had recognized that Richard's behavior was the actual problem. But what Zara didn't yet realize, what no one in the cabin yet understood, was that Richard Whitfield was not a man accustomed to accepting defeat, particularly not public defeat at the hands of people he considered beneath him. And in his humiliation and rage, he was already formulating a plan to reassert control, a plan that would have consequences far beyond anything he could anticipate. "Excuse me," he said to Laura as she passed his seat again. His tone was controlled now, almost pleasant, a dramatic shift that immediately put the flight attendant on alert. "Yes, sir. "I'd like to apologize for my reaction," Richard said smoothly. "The stress of my upcoming meeting clouded my judgment. Might I use the lavatory to compose myself? I promise to return directly to my seat afterward." The request seemed reasonable, even conciliatory. Laura nodded. "Of course, sir. The forward lavatory is available now." Richard smiled thinly and made his way to the front of the cabin. Once inside the lavatory, with the door locked behind him, his pleasant expression dissolved into a mask of cold fury. He pulled out his phone once more. There was indeed no signal for calls, but the device had other capabilities. Opening his email, he began composing a message to be sent automatically upon landing to Customer Relations Executive Offices. Subject: security concern on Flight 789. I am writing to express urgent concern regarding a passenger on Flight 789 who I believe may be traveling under false pretenses. A young female approximately 10 to 12 years old, claiming to be Zara Reynolds of Reynolds Technologies, is traveling unaccompanied in first class. Her behavior and responses to basic questions have raised significant concerns about her identity and the legitimacy of her travel arrangements. As a Platinum member with serious concerns about airline security protocols, I request immediate verification of this passenger's identity upon landing. Given the high-profile nature of the Reynolds family, there are obvious security implications if someone is impersonating their daughter. I expect this matter to be handled with appropriate urgency. Richard Whitfield, VP, Strategic Development. Whitfield Financial. He saved the draft, set it to send automatically upon detecting a network connection, and returned the phone to his pocket with grim satisfaction. If the girl really was Zara Reynolds, she would face only minor inconvenience while proving her identity. If, as he increasingly suspected, she was merely a precocious imposter using the Reynolds name for attention or upgraded seating, she would face appropriate consequences. Either way, Richard would regain control of the narrative. Rather than a disgruntled passenger who had been formally warned for disruptive behavior, he would become a concerned citizen looking out for airline security. The fact that the girl would face questioning and potential detention upon landing was to his mind merely a fitting response to her role in his humiliation. As Richard returned to his seat with a composed expression that masked his inner satisfaction, he had no way of knowing that his vindictive action would trigger a sequence of events that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his career and personal reputation. Nor could he anticipate that the true power dynamics at play were far more complex than he had calculated, and that Zara Reynolds possessed resources and influence that would make his attempted retaliation seem not only petty, but catastrophically misjudged. Captain Michael Torres frowned as he read the alert that had just appeared on the aircraft's secure communication system. As a veteran pilot with 23 years of experience, he prided himself on smooth flights and minimal disruptions. The message from ground security at San Francisco International Airport was therefore particularly unwelcome. Security alert: passenger verification required upon landing. Subject: Reynolds, Zara, seat 4A. Anonymous report of potential identity fraud/unauthorized travel. Torres exchanged a glance with his first officer, Lisa Hernandez. "What do you make of this?" he asked, indicating the message. Hernandez scanned it quickly. "Unusual timing," she noted. "This comes right after the disturbance in first class that Martinez reported." Torres nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly. Martinez mentioned a passenger named Whitfield, who was formally warned after refusing to comply with electronic device regulations. He seemed particularly hostile toward the young passenger in 4A. Possible retaliation, Hernandez suggested. "That would be my guess," Torres agreed. "But we still have to follow protocol on security alerts, regardless of the suspected motivation." He typed a response acknowledging receipt of the alert and requesting further information about the source of the report. Within minutes, a reply came through. Alert originated from email sent to airline security from passenger device. Sender identified as Whitfield Richard, seat 4D. Contents flag: potential identity fraud. Standard verification protocols apply upon landing. Torres's frown deepened. His suspicions confirmed he faced a delicate situation. Airline protocol required him to treat all security concerns as legitimate until proven otherwise. But his years of experience told him this was almost certainly a case of passenger retaliation rather than genuine security risk. Options he asked Hernandez, respecting his first officer's judgment. By the book, we notify the passenger discreetly conduct preliminary verification on board if possible, and coordinate with ground security for further verification if necessary. Hernandez replied. But given the circumstances, we need to be careful about potentially enabling harassment. Torres finished. Let's get more information first. He activated the intercom. Flight attendant to the cockpit, please. Laura Martinez appeared moments later, closing the cockpit door behind her. Captain Torres explained the situation succinctly. We've received a security alert specifically targeting the young passenger in 4A. Given what you've observed, do you believe this constitutes legitimate concern or passenger retaliation? Laura's expression darkened. Retaliation without question. Captain, Miss Reynolds has conducted herself with perfect propriety throughout the flight. Mr. Whitfield has displayed escalating hostility toward her, apparently triggered by her presence in first class, and exacerbated when he realized she might be connected to Reynolds Technologies. Is there any way to verify her identity on board? Hernandez asked. To potentially resolve this before landing, Laura considered this. She has her tablet and phone with her. If she has identification, or could contact someone who could confirm her identity. Torres nodded decisively. Here's how we'll handle this. Martinez, please discreetly inform Miss Reynolds of the situation. If she can provide preliminary identity verification on board, we'll communicate that to ground security to potentially expedite the process upon landing. Meanwhile, I'll alert our corporate security office about the possibility that this is a retaliatory false report, which is itself a federal offense. Yes, Captain Laura acknowledged, turning to leave. One more thing, Torres added. Make sure this conversation happens out of earshot of Mr. Whitfield. If this is indeed a false report, we don't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing his retaliation succeed. As Laura returned to the cabin, she found herself in the unusual position of dreading an interaction with a first-class passenger. How did one tell a child that an adult had essentially reported her to authorities out of spite? She approached Zara's seat casually, under the pretense of a routine check-in. How are you doing, Miss Reynolds? Can I get you anything? Zara looked up from her tablet. I'm fine, thank you. Laura lowered her voice. Miss Reynolds, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Perhaps you could accompany me to the galley under the pretense of selecting a snack. A flicker of concern crossed Zara's face, but she nodded calmly and followed Laura to the front galley out of sight and earshot of Richard Whitfield. I apologize for the unusual request, Laura began once they were alone, but a situation has developed that you should be aware of. The captain has received a security alert specifically concerning you, alleging potential identity fraud or unauthorized travel. Zara's eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. Mr. Whitfield reported me to security. Laura was impressed by the girl's immediate grasp of the situation. We believe so, yes. The report came from his seat through electronic means shortly after he was issued a formal warning. Rather than appearing frightened, Zara seemed to process this information with remarkable composure for someone her age. I see. What happens now? The captain is already communicating with corporate security about the likelihood that this is a false report. However, standard protocols require some verification of your identity. If you have any identification with you, or if there's someone who could confirm your identity. Zara reached into her pocket and withdrew a sleek smartphone. I can call my father. He's on this flight in economy. Or I can show you my school ID and passport. Either would be helpful, Laura assured her. The more verification we can provide before landing, the less disruption you'll face upon arrival. As Zara prepared to text her father, her expression grew troubled. He'll be upset. He's protective. Laura could certainly understand that. Any parent would be furious to learn their child had been targeted this way. "We are handling this as discreetly as possible," she assured Zara. "But I'm afraid your father will need to be informed." Zara nodded and typed a brief message to her father. "Need to see you. Meet me at forward galley." "Important, but I'm okay." Within 2 minutes, Solomon Reynolds appeared at the galley entrance, concern evident in his expression. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and the poised confidence that came from years of navigating hostile business environments as a black executive. Solomon's presence immediately filled the small space. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice controlled, but with an undercurrent of protective urgency as he looked between his daughter and the flight attendant. Laura explained the situation concisely. As she spoke, she watched Solomon's expression transition from concern to cold fury. "Let me understand this correctly," he said. When she had finished, "A passenger who was upset about my daughter occupying her rightfully assigned first-class seat has now reported her to security as a potential imposter after being formally warned for his own disruptive behavior." "That appears to be the case, yes," Laura confirmed. Solomon's voice remained remarkably calm, though the intensity in his eyes betrayed his anger. "I'd like to speak with the captain, please." Laura hesitated. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concern, but the captain is currently—" "Ms. Martinez." Solomon interrupted gently but firmly. "This is no longer about a seating dispute or passenger comfort. This is about a grown man targeting my 11-year-old daughter with a false security report, potentially subjecting her to detention and questioning upon landing. I believe that warrants a direct conversation with the captain." Put that way, Laura couldn't disagree. "I'll inform Captain Torres of your request." While Laura went to the cockpit, Zara looked up at her father. "I'm sorry, Dad. I thought I was handling it." Solomon's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "You have nothing to apologize for, Sparrow. You did handle it with more grace and maturity than most adults would have shown. But some situations can't be managed through individual composure alone. That's when systems and structures need to be engaged." Laura returned moments later. "The captain will speak with you now, Mr. Reynolds." As Solomon followed her to the cockpit, he turned back to Zara. "Wait here. I'll be back soon." Inside the cockpit, Captain Torres greeted Solomon with professional courtesy. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your concern about this situation. I want to assure you that we are taking this very seriously." Solomon nodded acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, Captain. My concern is not just for my daughter's immediate comfort, but for the precedent this sets. If passengers can weaponize security protocols for personal retaliation without consequences, you create an environment where marginalized travelers are perpetually vulnerable." Torres nodded grimly. "I couldn't agree more, Mr. Reynolds. That's why I've already initiated several measures. First, I've notified our corporate security office that we believe this is a false report, potentially constituting misuse of security systems. Second, I've requested that ground security conduct any necessary verification on board rather than removing your daughter from the aircraft. And third, I've documented the entire sequence of events, including Mr. Whitfield's prior behavior, in my official flight report." Solomon considered this. "Those are appropriate initial responses, Captain. However, I'd like to add another dimension to your considerations." He took out his own phone and pulled up a contact. "This is the direct number for Diane Chen, General Counsel for Reynolds Technologies. Upon landing, I'll be instructing her to explore all legal remedies for what appears to be targeted harassment of a minor. I believe the airline would prefer to be positioned as an ally in addressing this situation rather than a facilitator of discriminatory behavior." There was nothing threatening in Solomon's tone. He was simply laying out facts and their implications with the precision of a successful CEO. But the message was unmistakable. This situation had escalated beyond an ordinary customer service issue to one with potential legal and public relations ramifications. Captain Torres understood immediately. "Mr. Reynolds, you have my assurance that we will handle this situation with the utmost seriousness. To that end, I'd like to propose the following. Upon landing, a member of our executive customer relations team will meet the aircraft to address this matter personally. Your daughter will not be subjected to any additional security procedures beyond standard deplaning. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitfield will be asked to remain on board for a conversation with our security team regarding the potentially false report." Solomon nodded, satisfied with this approach. "That seems reasonable, Captain. I appreciate your responsiveness. One more thing," Torres added. "Would you be willing to provide some form of identification for your daughter now? It would help us further document the bad faith nature of Mr. Whitfield's report." "Of course." Solomon produced his daughter's passport from his pocket. "I keep her travel documents with me as a precaution." Torres examined the passport, which clearly confirmed Zara's identity, and made a note in the system. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. This will be helpful in expediting the process upon landing." As Solomon prepared to return to the cabin, Torres added, "For what it's worth, sir, I want to personally apologize for the discomfort your daughter has experienced on this flight. From what my crew has reported, she has conducted herself with remarkable poise in a difficult situation." Solomon's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Captain. Zara has had to develop that poise earlier than any child should, but I'm hopeful for a world where she won't need it quite so often." As he returned to the galley where Zara waited, Solomon was already composing a mental list of the calls he would make upon landing. This incident would not be allowed to fade into the background as just another example of everyday discrimination. Richard Whitfield was about to learn a valuable lesson about the consequences of targeting the wrong child with his prejudice and spite. Flight 789's wheels touched down at San Francisco International Airport with the smooth precision that characterized Captain Torres's landings. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the usual rustling of passengers preparing to deplane filled the cabin. Conversations resumed, seat belts clicked open, and the overhead bins creaked as they were opened for luggage retrieval. But in first class, an unusual tension persisted. Richard Whitfield sat rigid in his seat. His earlier satisfaction at having reported Zara now replaced by growing unease. Throughout the remainder of the flight, he had noticed increased activity in the galley, hushed conversations between crew members, and most troublingly, Solomon Reynolds had been escorted to the cockpit and returned with an expression of grim determination. Something had gone wrong with his plan, but Richard couldn't determine exactly what. He expected to see Zara pulled aside for questioning, upon landing a minor inconvenience for her, if she was legitimate appropriate consequences, if she wasn't. Either way, he would be vindicated as a concerned citizen rather than a troublemaker. Instead, as the aircraft approached the gate, Captain Torres's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that sent a chill through Richard's body. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco International Airport. Local time is 11:42 a.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 68 degrees. We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate, and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Once we've arrived, we have a special request. All passengers except those in seats 4A and 4D are free to deplane as usual. The passengers in 4A and 4D are asked to remain seated until airline representatives have boarded to address a specific matter." Richard felt his heart rate accelerate. This was not how security verifications were supposed to work. If anything, Zara should have been singled out, not both of them. Something had definitely gone wrong. Laura, observing his rising panic with professional detachment, approached his seat. Mr. Whitfield, as the captain, announced, "You'll need to remain on board after we reach the gate. Representatives from airline security will want to speak with you." About what exactly, Richard demanded, trying to maintain his composure. About the security report you filed concerning Miss Reynolds, Laura replied evenly. Filing false security reports is a federal offense with significant penalties. The representatives will want to discuss that with you directly. The blood drained from Richard's face as the implications became clear. Somehow his report had been traced back to him, and worse had already been determined to be false. He glanced across the aisle at Zara, who sat calmly in her seat, her father now standing protectively beside her. Solomon met Richard's gaze with a steady, evaluating look that made the businessman flinch and quickly look away. As the aircraft doors opened, passengers began the usual process of gathering belongings and filing toward the exit. Several cast curious glances at Richard and Zara, having overheard enough of the earlier confrontations to understand that something significant was unfolding. Elena Garcia paused as she prepared to leave. Miss Reynolds, she said warmly, it was a pleasure meeting you. I look forward to hearing your presentation at the conference tomorrow. Thank you, Ms. Garcia, Zara replied with a small smile. I appreciated your support during the flight. Martin Rivera also stopped briefly beside Zara's seat. Handled like a pro, he said with an approving nod. Some lessons come early in life, unfortunately. Sophia Williams handed her business card to Solomon as she passed. If you need a statement from a witness for any reason, please don't hesitate to contact me, she said, her meaning clear. James Bradford. The retired banking executive paused longest of all, looking directly at Richard with an expression of profound disappointment. I spent 40 years in finance, he said quietly. Men like you are why the industry struggles to evolve. Do better. With that, he continued toward the exit, leaving Richard staring after him in stunned silence. As the last regular passengers deplaned, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavier with anticipation. Solomon stood beside Zara's seat, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Richard sat alone, abandoned even by Laura, who had other deplaning duties to attend to. Finally, 3 individuals boarded the aircraft. The first was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a tailored suit with an airline executive badge. Behind her were 2 airport security officers in uniform, their expressions professionally neutral. Mr. Reynolds. Miss Reynolds, the woman greeted them with respectful courtesy. I'm Victoria Harrington, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for the discomfort you've experienced on this flight. We take incidents of passenger harassment extremely seriously. She then turned to Richard, her expression cooling noticeably. Mr. Whitfield, I'm afraid we need to address a serious matter. Our records indicate that you filed a security report alleging identity fraud concerning Miss Reynolds shortly after being formally warned for non-compliance with crew instructions. Given that Miss Reynolds' identity has been verified beyond any doubt, we're concerned about the motivation behind this report. Richard attempted to regain his corporate composure. There was no malicious intent, he insisted. I had genuine concerns about an unaccompanied minor in first class claiming to be connected to a prominent family. I was acting out of an abundance of caution. Victoria's expression made it clear she found this explanation lacking. Mr. Whitfield, our records show that prior to filing this report, you engaged in multiple confrontations specifically targeting Miss Reynolds, beginning with an attempt to take her assigned seat and escalating to demands that she be removed from the first-class cabin. This pattern suggests retaliation rather than genuine security concern. That's absurd, Richard protested, though, with noticeably less conviction. I was merely... In addition, Victoria continued undeterred, filing false security reports is a federal offense under 49 U.S.C. Section 46302, carrying penalties including fines up to $10,000 and potential imprisonment. Given the circumstances, airport security has requested to speak with you further. At this, one of the security officers stepped forward. Mr. Whitfield, please gather your belongings and come with us. The reality of his situation finally seemed to penetrate Richard's bubble of entitlement. His face paled further as he realized the potential consequences of his vindictive action, not just professional embarrassment or a stern talking to, but actual legal jeopardy. "Surely this isn't necessary," he said, attempting to salvage some dignity. "There's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, Mr. Whitfield Solomon spoke for the first time since the officials had boarded, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "What you've done is attempt to weaponize security protocols to intimidate and punish a child whose only offense was occupying space you felt she didn't deserve. That isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern of behavior that reflects a deeply troubling mindset." Richard turned to Solomon, desperation beginning to show through his crumbling professional facade. "Mr. Reynolds, surely you understand the pressure of business travel, the need for certain standards." "What I understand," Solomon interrupted gently, "is that you saw my daughter, a young black girl, traveling alone, and automatically assumed she didn't belong in first class. When evidence contradicted that assumption, rather than reconsidering your bias, you escalated your efforts to remove her from a space you felt should be reserved for people who look like you. When those efforts failed, you attempted to use security protocols as a weapon of retaliation." Solomon's analysis was so precise, so calmly delivered, and so undeniably accurate that Richard had no response. He stared at Solomon, then at Zara, and finally at the security officers waiting to escort him from the aircraft. "My belongings," he said weakly, reaching for his briefcase in the overhead bin. As Richard gathered his things under the watchful eyes of the security officers, Victoria turned back to the Reynolds family. "Mr. Reynolds. Miss Reynolds, an executive car is waiting to take you to your hotel. Again, on behalf of the airline, I deeply regret this incident. We'll be conducting a thorough review of our training procedures to ensure nothing like this happens in the future." Solomon nodded acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, Ms. Harrington. I'll be following up with your corporate offices regarding broader policy implications. This isn't just about one difficult passenger. It's about ensuring that all travelers are treated with equal respect and dignity." As they prepared to leave the aircraft, Zara turned to her father. "Dad, what's going to happen to Mr. Whitfield?" Solomon considered his daughter's question carefully. "That will depend on several factors, Sparrow. The airline and airport authorities will investigate his actions. He may face fines or other penalties for filing a false report. His company will likely be notified, which could have professional consequences." "I don't want to ruin his life," Zara said quietly. "I just wanted to be treated fairly." Solomon squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's because you have compassion, even for people who don't show it to you. That's a strength, not a weakness. But sometimes consequences are necessary, not out of vengeance, but because they're the only way some people learn to examine their behavior." As they walked through the terminal toward their waiting car, Solomon couldn't help but feel a complex mix of emotions: pride in his daughter's composure and maturity, anger that she had been forced to develop such resilience at such a young age, determination to use this incident to push for broader change. What neither of them realized yet was how far the ripples from this incident would spread from a San Francisco airport security office to corporate boardrooms, from social media platforms to policy discussions about bias and accountability in commercial aviation. Richard Whitfield had assumed he was punishing a presumptuous child for occupying space he felt she didn't deserve. Instead, he had inadvertently triggered a sequence of events that would challenge entrenched patterns of discrimination in ways that would extend far beyond Flight 789. Richard Whitfield sat in a sterile interview room at San Francisco International Airport's security office, the enormity of his situation finally sinking in. The initial questioning had been conducted with professional detachment by Officers Ramirez and Johnson, who had methodically documented his statements regarding the security report he had filed. Now he waited alone. His expensive suit wrinkled from the flight, his confidence shattered by the rapid reversal of fortune. Just hours ago, he had been Vice President Richard Whitfield, en route to an important investors' meeting secure in his status and authority. Now he was a potential federal offender, detained in an airport security office, while his colleagues wondered about his absence. The door opened, and a woman in a tailored suit entered, carrying a tablet and a folder of documents. "Mr. Whitfield? I'm Samantha Alvarez, legal counsel for the airline. I'm here to discuss the situation regarding your security report concerning Miss Reynolds." Richard straightened, clinging to what remained of his corporate demeanor. "This has been blown completely out of proportion. It was a simple misunderstanding." Samantha sat across from him, her expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Whitfield, I've reviewed the captain's report statements from flight attendants and multiple passengers and the content of your security alert. This doesn't appear to be a simple misunderstanding. It appears to be a deliberate attempt to misuse security protocols for retaliatory purposes after a series of confrontational interactions targeting a minor passenger." She opened the folder and laid several documents on the table between them. "We have witness statements confirming that you attempted to take Miss Reynolds' assigned seat, made dismissive comments about her right to be in first class, demanded that she be relocated to economy, and refused to comply with crew instructions regarding electronic devices. Following a formal warning from the flight attendant, you filed a security report alleging identity fraud, despite having no legitimate basis for such a claim." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Laid out so systematically, his actions seemed indefensible even to himself. "I was under significant stress. My behavior was not typical." Perhaps not, Samantha acknowledged. But stress doesn't explain or excuse targeting a child with a false security report. That crosses a line from poor behavior into potentially criminal action. She tapped her tablet, bringing up a document. "The airline has several options at this point. We could pursue federal charges under 49 U.S.C. Firebaus 46302 for knowingly filing a false security report. We could also permanently ban you from future travel on our airline and share that information with our partner carriers." Richard felt a cold wave of panic. A federal charge would destroy his career instantly. A travel ban would make his position at Whitfield Financial untenable, given their international client base. However, Samantha continued, "We also recognize that punitive measures alone rarely address the underlying issues. So I'm authorized to offer an alternative approach." Richard leaned forward, desperate for any lifeline. "I'm listening." "The airline is developing a comprehensive anti-bias training program for both staff and frequent travelers. As part of this initiative, we're creating case studies based on real incidents. We would like to use this incident, anonymized, of course, as one such case study." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "In exchange for your full cooperation with this educational initiative, including a detailed statement acknowledging your actions and reflecting on their impact, the airline would be willing to refrain from pursuing federal charges or implementing a permanent travel ban." Richard blinked, processing the offer. It wasn't what he had expected. "You want me to contribute to an educational program about my own behavior?" "Precisely," Samantha confirmed. "We believe there's educational value in examining how implicit biases manifest in travel environments and how they can escalate into discriminatory behavior. Your perspective, particularly your thought process during the incident, would provide valuable insight for our training materials." Richard sat back, considering the proposal. It was humiliating, certainly, to have his behavior dissected as a case study in what not to do. But compared to federal charges or a career-ending travel ban— "What about my company?" he asked finally. "Will they be informed?" "That's not within the airline's purview," Samantha replied carefully. "However, I should note that this incident has already attracted attention on social media. Several passengers recorded portions of the interactions, and these videos are currently circulating online. We cannot control that aspect of the situation." Richard closed his eyes briefly, imagining the professional fallout. Marcus Townsend, the CEO of Whitfield Financial, was obsessively concerned with the company's public image, particularly as they attempted to position themselves as forward-thinking in an increasingly diverse financial landscape. "I need to make some calls," he said finally. "To my company, to explain my absence from the meeting." Samantha nodded. "That can be arranged after you've made your decision regarding our proposal. We'll need your answer today." As she gathered her documents to leave, Richard found himself asking a question that surprised even him. The girl, Zara, is she actually Solomon Reynolds' daughter? The tech innovator. Samantha looked at him with an unreadable expression. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield. She is indeed Zara Reynolds, founder of Edu Empowerment and daughter of Solomon Reynolds. She was traveling to deliver a presentation at the Tech Forward conference, the same conference where I believe your company is attempting to attract technology sector investments." The irony was not lost on Richard. In his attempt to put a presumptuous child in her place, he had potentially sabotaged his company's relationship with one of the most influential figures in the very industry they were trying to court. Left alone again, Richard sat with the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For the first time, he forced himself to honestly examine what had driven his behavior on that flight. Why had the sight of a young black girl in first class triggered such immediate rejection? Why had he found her calm self-assurance so threatening? Why had he escalated a simple seating misunderstanding into a federal offense? The answers were uncomfortable, forcing him to confront aspects of himself he had long denied or rationalized away. As a middle-aged white man in finance, he had grown accustomed to certain privileges and deferences. The changing demographics of power, exemplified by people like Solomon Reynolds and his prodigious daughter, represented a challenge to the world order Richard understood and benefited from. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Marcus Townsend's name. Taking a deep breath, Richard prepared himself for what would likely be the most difficult professional conversation of his career. Outside in the main terminal, oblivious to Richard's personal reckoning, passengers from Flight 789 continued to share their experiences on social media. Videos of the confrontation were being uploaded, comments were flooding in, and a hashtag was beginning to trend: "First class while black." What had begun as one man's biased assumption was rapidly transforming into a national conversation about who is questioned when they occupy prestigious spaces and who is automatically assumed to belong. The executive car provided by the airline pulled up to the entrance of the Fairmont San Francisco, one of the city's most prestigious hotels. As Solomon and Zara Reynolds stepped from the vehicle, they were immediately greeted by the hotel manager and several staff members, all clearly briefed on the situation and eager to provide exemplary service to compensate for their earlier experience. "Mr. Reynolds, Miss Reynolds," the manager said with a warm but respectful smile. "Welcome to the Fairmont. We have your suite prepared and have taken the liberty of arranging a light meal, as I understand your flight arrival was delayed. Is there anything else we can provide to make you more comfortable after your journey?" Solomon thanked him politely but declined additional accommodations. After the public nature of the confrontation on the flight, both he and Zara craved privacy. More than anything, as they were escorted to their suite, Solomon noticed his daughter's unusual quietness. Normally, after a flight, Zara would be analyzing the efficiency of the airline's processes or discussing her observations about fellow travelers, her mind constantly processing information, finding patterns, imagining improvements. Today she walked beside him in silence, her usual sparkle dimmed. Once inside their suite, a spacious accommodation with panoramic views of the San Francisco Bay, Solomon placed their bags down and turned to his daughter. "Talk to me, Sparrow," he said gently. Zara moved to the window, looking out at the city below. "I keep thinking about Mr. Whitfield," she said finally. Solomon joined her at the window, surprised by her focus. "What about him?" "He's going to lose a lot because of what happened today," she said. "His job, maybe. His reputation. All because he couldn't see past what he expected to see when he looked at me. Solomon studied his daughter's profile, struck once again by how much she resembled Catherine, not just in her features, but in her capacity for empathy, even toward those who had treated her poorly. "That's not on you," he said firmly. "His choices, his actions, his consequences." I know Zara agreed, but it still feels, I don't know, heavy, like nothing really got solved. He'll face consequences, but will he understand why what he did was wrong? Will it change how he sees people who look like me? Or will he just feel like a victim of political correctness, or whatever people call it when they get in trouble for discrimination? Solomon placed a hand on her shoulder. "Those are profound questions, Sparrow. And honestly, I don't have perfect answers. Whether Mr. Whitfield learns from this depends largely on his willingness to examine his own assumptions and biases. Some people do that work when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Others double down and blame the system for holding them accountable. I want it to matter," Zara said simply. "I want it to be more than just one person getting in trouble. I want it to change something." Solomon nodded, understanding exactly what his daughter meant. Throughout his career, he had faced countless Richard Whitfield's people who questioned his qualifications, his right to occupy leadership positions, his legitimacy in prestigious spaces. Individual confrontations might be satisfying in the moment, but true change required structural shifts. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted, "about how to make this incident matter beyond just one flight or one passenger." He moved to retrieve his laptop from his carry-on. "While you were napping on the drive here, I started drafting some ideas. The airline seems genuinely invested in addressing what happened, not just as a PR exercise, but as an opportunity for real change. Victoria Harrington, the executive who met us at the gate, has asked if we'd be willing to consult on their new training initiatives." Zara's expression brightened slightly. "Like using Edu Empowerment's methodology for their staff training?" "Exactly," Solomon confirmed. "Your adaptive learning approach could be perfect for helping airline staff recognize and address bias in real-time interactions. It's a chance to transform an unpleasant personal experience into a structural improvement that could benefit countless travelers." Zara considered this, her analytical mind already beginning to envision the possibilities. "We could develop specific modules for different roles, gate agents, flight attendants, pilots, and incorporate real scenarios for them to work through with feedback tailored to their responses." Solomon smiled, relieved to see his daughter's natural enthusiasm returning. "That's my girl, always looking for the opportunity to build something better." "And what about Mr. Whitfield?" Zara asked, returning to her earlier concern. "What happens to him now?" "That's largely up to him," Solomon replied honestly. "The airline has offered him an alternative to formal charges or a travel ban participation in their educational initiatives, essentially turning his mistake into a learning opportunity for others." "Do you think he'll accept?" Solomon considered the question. "Hard to say. It requires acknowledging wrongdoing and examining uncomfortable truths about oneself. Some people aren't capable of that kind of reflection." Zara nodded thoughtfully. "I hope he does. Not just for his sake, but because it might actually be more valuable than just punishing him." Solomon felt a surge of pride at his daughter's wisdom. At 11, she already understood something that many adults never grasped, that true justice wasn't about revenge, but about creating the conditions for growth and change. His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Diane Chen, General Counsel for Reynolds Technologies. "It's Diane," he told Zara. "Probably with an update on the airline situation. Why don't you review your presentation for tomorrow while I take this? Then we can order dinner and have an early night. It's been quite a day." As Zara settled at the desk with her tablet, Solomon moved to the bedroom to take the call in privacy. The conversation with Diane would no doubt be focused on legal implications, potential actions, and strategic considerations. all necessary aspects of addressing what had happened. But watching his daughter already immersed in her work, resilient despite the day's events, Solomon knew that the most important outcome had already been achieved. Zara had faced discrimination and emerged with her dignity intact, her compassion undiminished, and her focus on creating positive change strengthened. That more than any legal action or corporate policy change was the true victory of the day. By evening, videos of the confrontation on Flight 789 had spread across social media platforms, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. What had begun as a personal encounter between two passengers had transformed into a national conversation about race privilege and who is questioned when they occupy prestigious spaces. Major news outlets picked up the story with headlines ranging from the straightforward black child prodigy targeted on flight to the more provocative first class while black tech billionaire's daughter faces discrimination. Commentators from across the political spectrum weighed in, each framing the incident according to their particular perspectives on race and accountability in American society. In a quiet corner of the hotel restaurant, Elena Garcia scrolled through her phone, monitoring the unfolding coverage. As founder and CEO of Garcia Innovations, she was no stranger to the dynamics that had played out on that flight. Having witnessed the incident firsthand, she felt a responsibility to ensure the narrative remained accurate. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from her PR director. "Elena, have you seen the coverage of the flight incident? Several reporters are reaching out for your statement since you were identified in some of the videos." Elena sighed. "I was afraid of that. Schedule a brief call for tomorrow morning. I want to be thoughtful about how I address this. It's important that we focus on the underlying issues rather than just the spectacle." As she ended the call, Elena noticed Sophia Williams, the attorney from the flight, entering the restaurant. She raised a hand in greeting, and Sophia made her way over to her table. "Mind if I join you?" Sophia asked. "I could use a colleague to decompress with after today's events." Elena gestured to the empty chair. "Please. I could use the same." As Sophia settled into her seat, she glanced at Elena's phone, which displayed one of the viral videos from the flight. "It's everywhere, isn't it?" "Unavoidably," Elena confirmed. "Though I'm not sure how many people are seeing past the dramatic confrontation to the underlying patterns it represents." Sophia nodded in understanding. "That's often the challenge with these incidents. The spectacle overshadows the structural issues. As an attorney, I've seen countless cases where individual incidents become flashpoints for public attention, but the deeper patterns remain unaddressed." Exactly, Elena agreed. What struck me most wasn't just Whitfield's behavior. I've encountered plenty of Richards in my career, but how the systems initially aligned to support his assumptions. The flight attendant's initial handling of the seating dispute, the automatic deference to his complaints, the hesitation to enforce rules equally. Until Solomon Reynolds entered the picture, Sophia noted. It's telling that it took the intervention of a billionaire CEO to ensure his daughter received fair treatment, which is precisely the problem, Elena pointed out. Most people facing discrimination don't have that level of influence to deploy. What happens to them? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Bradford, the retired banking executive who had also been on Flight 789. He hesitated at their table. "Ladies, I couldn't help overhearing your discussion. I was on the flight as well, seat 3F. Would you mind if I joined you? I've been grappling with some uncomfortable realizations since we landed." Elena and Sophia exchanged glances, then nodded their welcome. As Bradford settled into a chair, he seemed to choose his words carefully. "I spent 40 years in investment banking," he began. "Most of that time I considered myself one of the good ones, not actively discriminatory, occasionally mentoring promising minority candidates, donating to appropriate causes." He paused, looking troubled. "But watching that confrontation today forced me to confront how often I've been complicit in exactly the dynamics we witnessed. How many times I remained silent when colleagues questioned whether diverse candidates really had the qualifications or belonged in leadership positions. How often I benefited from systems designed to automatically extend credibility and deference to people who look like me. Sophia's expression remained professionally neutral, but Elena leaned forward slightly, appreciating Bradford's candor. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "Many never get that far. Recognition without action feels hollow at this point in my life." Bradford replied, "I've been retired for 3 years now, but I still sit on several boards. I'm realizing I have a responsibility to use that position to question patterns I previously accepted as normal." Their conversation continued as dinner was served. 3 professionals from different fields and backgrounds, united by their shared witness to a revealing moment of American social dynamics. Throughout the restaurant, similar conversations were taking place at other tables. Passengers from Flight 789 processing what they had seen, examining their own responses, debating the proper consequences for Richard Whitfield. Meanwhile, across the city, in a considerably less prestigious hotel room, Richard Whitfield sat alone, staring at his laptop screen. The email from Marcus Townsend, CEO of Whitfield Financial, was brief but devastating. "Richard, in light of today's incident and the associated media coverage, your presence at tomorrow's meeting with Reynolds Technologies would be counterproductive. Please remain in San Francisco, but do not attend the conference or attempt to contact the Reynolds family. We will discuss your status with the firm upon your return to Chicago." Richard closed his laptop with a shaking hand. The professional consequences he had feared were already materializing. Decades of carefully building his reputation, his position, his authority, all potentially undone by a single flight, and his inability to see past his own assumptions. For the first time in his life, Richard Whitfield was being forced to confront not just the external consequences of his actions, but the internal biases that had driven them. It was a reckoning both painful and necessary, the kind of profound discomfort that precedes either genuine growth or deeper entrenchment in defensive denial. Which path he would choose remained to be seen. But regardless of Richard's personal journey, the conversations sparked by Flight 789 were already rippling outward. Challenging assumptions, questioning patterns, and forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about who is automatically granted dignity and belonging in shared spaces, and who must continuously fight to claim what should be freely given to all. Victoria Harrington strode purposefully into the executive conference room at San Francisco International Airport's airline headquarters. As Senior Vice President of Customer Experience, she had managed countless crises throughout her career, but the situation unfolding around Flight 789 was uniquely challenging. The room was already filled with key personnel, legal counsel Samantha Alvarez, Communications Director James Winters, Chief Diversity Officer Maria Lopez, and joining via video conference CEO Rachel Davidson. The tension was palpable as Victoria took her place at the head of the table. "I assume everyone has been briefed on the basics," Victoria began without preamble. A high-profile incident occurred on Flight 789 from Chicago involving discriminatory behavior targeted at Zara Reynolds, daughter of Solomon Reynolds. The incident has gone viral on social media and is now being covered by major news outlets. Current status update, she continued. Whitfield is considering our alternative resolution proposal, participation in our educational initiatives, rather than formal charges or a travel ban. The Reynolds family has been accommodated at the Fairmont and has expressed interest in potentially collaborating on improvements to our training programs. The social media situation, James Winters inquired, his attention focused on his tablet, where he was monitoring real-time metrics. Escalating, Victoria confirmed. The hashtag #CastFirstClass. While Black is trending nationally, we have multiple videos circulating with combined views now exceeding 12 million. Sentiment analysis shows public opinion is strongly supportive of Miss Reynolds and critical of both Mr. Whitfield, and more concerning for us, the airline's initial handling of the situation. Rachel Davidson's voice came clearly through the conference room speakers. Let's be honest about where we failed here. From what I've seen in the reports, our flight attendant initially sided with Whitfield, despite clear evidence that Miss Reynolds had the correct seat assignment. That points to implicit bias in our frontline staff, and it's not an isolated incident. Maria Lopez nodded in agreement. We've documented similar patterns in customer complaints over the past 18 months. Black passengers, particularly women, report being questioned about their seating assignments at significantly higher rates than white passengers, even when accounting for other variables. The liability concerns are substantial, Samantha added. If the Reynolds family decides to pursue legal action, this incident, combined with the pattern data Maria mentioned, could support claims of discriminatory practices. Victoria looked around the table, taking in each person's concern. I think we all recognize that this is both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis is obvious significant public relations damage, potential legal liability, and harm to a child passenger that never should have occurred. But the opportunity is equally significant. Solomon Reynolds isn't just any passenger's father, she continued. He's an influential tech CEO with a demonstrated commitment to educational innovation through his daughter's company. The fact that they've expressed willingness to work with us rather than immediately pursuing legal action gives us a chance to develop meaningful solutions rather than just damage control. Rachel's voice came through again, thoughtful but decisive. Victoria, you've spoken with them directly. What's your assessment of what they want from this situation? Victoria considered the question carefully. Based on my conversation with Mr. Reynolds, I believe he's less interested in punitive measures against the airline and more focused on structural changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. He specifically mentioned his daughter's educational platform, Edu Empowerment, which uses adaptive learning technology to personalize educational experiences. You think they want us to implement their technology? James asked skeptically. I think they want the incident to matter beyond just one flight or one passenger. Victoria clarified. And given that their company specializes in creating personalized learning experiences that adapt to individual needs and backgrounds, there could be genuine value in exploring collaboration. Maria leaned forward with interest. Edu Empowerment's methodology is actually quite innovative. They use AI-driven scenarios that adapt based on user responses, revealing and addressing unconscious biases through immersive learning rather than traditional sensitivity training. It's shown impressive results in educational settings. Cost considerations, Rachel inquired. Samantha cleared her throat. Frankly, whatever the cost of implementing a new training program, it would be substantially less than the potential financial impact of litigation, regulatory scrutiny, and continued public relations damage. And that's not even addressing the moral imperative to do better. Rachel was quiet for a moment, then spoke with clear authority. Here's what we're going to do. Victoria, I want you to develop a comprehensive proposal for a partnership with Reynolds Technologies focusing on implementing their educational methodology for our staff training. Maria work with HR to conduct an immediate review of our policies regarding seating verification and passenger complaints with concrete recommendations for reducing bias in these interactions. She paused briefly, then continued. James develop a communication strategy that acknowledges our shortcomings transparently while highlighting our commitment to meaningful change. And Samantha prepare contingency plans for various scenarios regarding Mr. Whitfield's decision and potential legal implications. Victoria nodded, already making notes on next steps. Timeline: I want preliminary plans on all fronts within 48 hours. Rachel replied firmly. This incident is already defining public perception of our airline. I want our response to be equally defining, not just a corporate apology, but a genuine commitment to structural improvement. As the meeting shifted to detailed planning, Victoria found herself reflecting on the deeper implications of what had occurred. An 11-year-old girl had been subjected to humiliation and discrimination on their aircraft, an experience no child should endure. The fact that the girl in question happened to be the daughter of an influential CEO meant the incident had garnered unusual attention and would likely lead to meaningful changes. But how many similar incidents occurred daily without such visibility or consequence? How many passengers without Solomon Reynolds' influence suffered quietly, their experiences never becoming catalysts for institutional change? That was the larger question that would need to be addressed beyond the immediate crisis management. The meeting continued late into the evening as the airline executives worked to craft a response that would address both the specific incident and the broader patterns it represented. By the time they adjourned, a framework was in place for what would become one of the most comprehensive anti-bias initiatives in the airline industry, all sparked by a seating dispute that had revealed far deeper issues about who is questioned when they occupy prestigious spaces and who is automatically assumed to belong. After a light room service dinner, Zara and Solomon Reynolds sat in their hotel suite's comfortable living area, the San Francisco skyline glittering beyond the windows. Zara had finished reviewing her presentation for the conference and was now curled on the sofa, unusually quiet and reflective. Solomon watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. He had witnessed her composure throughout the day's events, her dignity in the face of discrimination, her thoughtfulness even toward those who had treated her poorly. But he also recognized the emotional toll such experiences inevitably took, especially on a child still forming her understanding of the world and her place in it. "You're thinking deep thoughts, Sparrow," he observed gently. "Want to share them?" Zara looked up from the tablet she'd been absently scrolling. "I was just reading some of the social media posts about what happened today. There are so many people sharing similar experiences, not just on planes, in restaurants, stores, hotels, everywhere. It's like what happened to me is just normal." Solomon moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "Unfortunately, it is normal, and that's precisely what makes it so important to address. But that's what I'm struggling with," Zara admitted. "Today feels important because of who you are, because you have influence and resources and connections. What about all the other people who get treated that way but don't have those advantages?" The question hit Solomon directly in the heart. It was a tension he had navigated throughout his career, using his growing influence to address inequities, while recognizing that the very system that now responded to his power was the same one that ignored those without it. "That's a profound question," Solomon acknowledged, looking at his daughter with newfound appreciation for her moral clarity. "And you're right. There's a painful irony in the fact that the incident is getting attention and response because of who we are when countless others face similar discrimination without recourse." He shifted to face Zara more directly. "I struggled with this same question early in my career. When I started gaining influence, I wondered if using that privilege to address discrimination somehow validated a broken system, one that only responds to power and money." "Did you figure it out?" Zara asked. Solomon smiled ruefully. "Not entirely. It's a tension I still navigate daily. But I did reach a working philosophy that helps me sleep at night." He gestured toward the city lights beyond their window. "I see it as having 3 responsibilities when you have privilege or power. First, use it to create immediate justice in specific situations like what happened today. Second, leverage it to push for structural changes that benefit everyone, not just those with similar advantages. And third, perhaps most importantly, work to distribute that power more equitably over time." Zara considered this thoughtfully. "Like using edu-empowerment to help the airline improve their training?" "Exactly." Solomon nodded. "That's addressing the structural level, potentially helping all travelers, not just us, But we can go further. What if we worked with them to implement a transparent reporting system for bias incidents? Or helped develop clear protocols that reduce individual discretion in situations where bias often occurs? Zara's expression brightened slightly as she engaged with these possibilities. We could also use our platform to amplify others' experiences, people who don't have the same reach we do. Now you're thinking like a true change maker, Solomon said, pride evident in his voice. Use the spotlight when it finds you, but always work to widen its beam. A comfortable silence fell between them as Zara processed these ideas. Then, almost hesitantly, she asked a question that revealed the deeper emotional impact of the day's events. Dad, do you think it ever stops? The assumptions, the questioning, the having to prove you belong. The vulnerability in her question pierced Solomon's heart. He wished he could offer simple reassurance, but he respected his daughter too much to shield her from difficult truths. I wish I could tell you it does, he said gently. But in my experience, it doesn't stop completely. It changes form as you gain recognition and influence. The overt challenges become less frequent, but subtler forms of questioning persist. Seeing Zara's expression fall slightly, he continued. But what does change is your relationship to those experiences. They begin to feel less like personal wounds and more like data points confirming what you already know about how systems operate. That doesn't sound very comforting, Zara observed. Solomon smiled ruefully. It's not meant to be comfortable, it's meant to be fortifying. Your mother used to say that comfort isn't always what we need most. Sometimes we need truth even when it's difficult. At the mention of her mother, Zara's eyes grew slightly misty. I was thinking about Mom today on the plane, wondering what she would have done. Solomon's expression softened. She would have handled it with the same dignity and composure you showed, but she also wouldn't have let it slide. Catherine was masterful at addressing discrimination in ways that educated rather than just condemned. I miss her wisdom, Zara said quietly. Me too, Sparrow. Every day. Solomon put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. But I see so much of her wisdom living on in you, in your compassion for others, your commitment to making systems better, not just winning individual battles. Zara leaned against her father, drawing comfort from his presence. I keep thinking about Mr. Whitfield, she admitted, about what made him so angry at me for just existing in that seat. Solomon considered this thoughtfully. People like Richard Whitfield have constructed their identity around certain hierarchies and expectations. When reality contradicts those expectations, when a young black girl occupies a space he assumed was reserved for people like him, it challenges not just his assumptions, but his sense of how the world should work. That sounds exhausting, Zara observed. Always needing the world to confirm your expectations. Solomon chuckled. Indeed it is. There's a certain freedom in approaching the world with curiosity rather than expectation, something you've always done naturally. Do you think he'll learn from this? Zara asked, returning to her earlier concern about meaningful change. That's up to him, Solomon replied honestly. Some people use moments of reckoning as catalysts for genuine reflection and growth. Others retreat further into defensive justifications and victimhood. We can't control which path he chooses, but we can focus on creating systems that encourage reflection rather than mere compliance. Zara nodded thoughtfully. Then, with a hint of her usual analytical precision, she asked, "What's our next step, practically speaking, beyond tomorrow's presentation?" Solomon smiled at his daughter's characteristic shift from philosophical reflection to strategic action. Tomorrow after your presentation, we'll meet with Victoria Harrington from the airline to discuss potential collaboration on their training initiatives. I've also asked Diane to prepare documentation of the incident from a legal perspective, not necessarily for litigation, but to ensure we have a clear record. And what about the social media attention? Zara asked, gesturing to her tablet, where notifications continued to accumulate. Should we respond? I think we should. But thoughtfully, Solomon replied, this isn't about creating a spectacle or positioning ourselves as victims. It's about using the platform we've been given to advance a constructive conversation about bias and accountability. He paused, then added with gentle firmness, but for tonight, I think we both need rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and you have an important presentation to deliver. Zara nodded finally, showing signs of the exhaustion that had been building throughout this demanding day. As she prepared for bed, Solomon found himself reflecting on how profoundly proud Catherine would be of their daughter, not just for her extraordinary intellectual gifts, but for her moral compass and resilience in the face of injustice. The incident on Flight 789 had been painful and unnecessary, but watching Zara process it with such maturity and thoughtfulness reassured Solomon that she was developing the inner resources needed to navigate a world that would not always recognize her worth at first glance. That knowledge provided a measure of comfort as he confronted the reality that he could not shield her from every instance of discrimination she would face. What he could do, what they could do together, was work to create systems where such discrimination became increasingly rare and consistently addressed. It wasn't a perfect solution to the imperfect world Zara was inheriting, but it was a path forward that honored both the reality of present challenges and the possibility of a more equitable future. 1 month after the Tech Forward conference, Zara Reynolds sat in the corner of a quiet cafe in Chicago's Loop, reviewing data from Edu Empowerment's latest implementation in Detroit public schools. The pilot program was showing promising results, with significant improvements in student engagement and achievement metrics, particularly among students previously categorized as at risk. Absorbed in her analysis, she didn't immediately notice the middle-aged man who had entered the cafe and now stood hesitantly near her table. When she finally looked up, she recognized him instantly. Richard Whitfield, the passenger from Flight 789, whose discriminatory behavior had gone viral. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice lacking the dismissive arrogance she remembered from their encounter. "I apologize for the intrusion. I recognized you and, well, I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you directly." Zara felt an immediate surge of complex emotions. Discomfort at the unexpected encounter, curiosity about what had brought him to approach her, and a certain wariness born from their previous interaction. But beneath these immediate reactions was a deeper recognition that this moment represented a potential bridge between the abstract discussions of accountability and the reality of human growth and change. "Mr. Whitfield," she acknowledged with composed neutrality, "this is unexpected. I understand if you'd prefer I leave?" He said, the uncertainty in his tone a stark contrast to his previous condescension. "I wouldn't blame you after my behavior on that flight." Zara considered her options. She could politely dismiss him, which would be entirely justified given their history. Or she could engage with this unexpected opportunity to understand what had followed from that viral confrontation. Her natural curiosity and commitment to meaningful change, rather than mere punishment, led her to gesture toward the empty chair across from her. "You can sit," she said simply. "I have a few minutes." Richard settled into the chair, visibly uncomfortable, but seemingly determined to proceed with whatever he had come to say. "I've been participating in the airline's new training program," he began, "the one your father helped develop. It's been illuminating." In what way? Zara asked, genuine interest overcoming her initial reservations. Richard seemed to choose his words carefully. "It helped me recognize patterns in my thinking that I'd never examined before. Assumptions that operated below the level of conscious thought about who belongs in certain spaces, whose presence needs justification, whose doesn't." He paused, then continued with evident difficulty. "I want to apologize for how I treated you on that flight. Not just the seating dispute, but the security report afterward. It was inexcusable. Zara studied him thoughtfully. The man before her bore little resemblance to the arrogant, dismissive passenger who had attempted to intimidate her a month earlier. There was a humility to his demeanor now, a thoughtfulness that suggested genuine reflection rather than mere damage control. What happened after the flight? She asked, curious about the path that had led to this apparent transformation. Richard's expression tightened slightly. Professionally, I was removed from my position at Whitfield Financial. The board felt my actions reflected poorly on the company's values and damaged crucial business relationships. He glanced down at his coffee cup. Personally, a more complicated reckoning. My wife and daughter were deeply disappointed in me. My daughter, who's not much older than you, refused to speak to me for 2 weeks after seeing the videos. That, more than the professional consequences, forced me to really examine myself. The mention of his daughter humanized Richard in a way their previous interaction had not. Zara could see the genuine pain and regret in his expression, not just for the consequences he had faced, but for the recognition of how his behavior had affected others. "I'm sorry about your job," she said honestly. "That wasn't what my father or I wanted." Richard looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "That's remarkably generous of you, given how I treated you. But the responsibility is mine alone. Actions have consequences, as I've learned rather dramatically." "What are you doing now?" Zara asked. "Consulting work, primarily," Richard replied. "And somewhat ironically, I've been asked to participate in the development of the airline's new training program to provide the perspective of someone who has had to confront their own biases very publicly." Zara couldn't suppress a small smile at this unexpected development. "That's actually a constructive application of the experience." "It's been humbling," Richard admitted, "but also meaningful in ways I wouldn't have anticipated. I've spent decades in finance without ever really examining the assumptions that shaped my interactions with others. Now I'm being asked to articulate those assumptions explicitly to understand their origins and implications." As their conversation continued, Zara found herself engaged by Richard's evident commitment to genuine reflection and growth. It wasn't a perfect resolution. No single conversation could erase the harm of discrimination or completely transform ingrained patterns of thought. But it represented something valuable, nonetheless the possibility that accountability could lead not just to punishment, but to meaningful change. When Richard eventually rose to leave, he extended his hand with a respect entirely absent from their first encounter. "Thank you for your willingness to speak with me, Miss Reynolds. It means more than I can adequately express." Zara shook his hand, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for having the courage to approach me, Mr. Whitfield. Not everyone would have done that." After Richard departed, Zara remained at her table, reflecting on the unexpected encounter. She reached for her phone to text her father about what had just occurred, knowing Solomon would find it as significant as she did. Not as a neat resolution to their experience, but as evidence that the structural changes they had helped initiate were creating space for individual transformation as well. The incident on Flight 789 would always remain a part of her story, a painful example of the discrimination she would likely face throughout her life and career. But this follow-up encounter suggested that such experiences, while never justified or acceptable, could sometimes catalyze growth and change beyond what punitive measures alone might accomplish. It wasn't a complete answer to the challenges of discrimination in everyday spaces, but it was a reminder that human capacity for growth and change, however imperfect and incomplete, remained a necessary component of creating a more equitable world, not instead of structural reforms, but alongside them. 1 year after the incident on Flight 789, Zara Reynolds stood on a different stage in a different city, addressing a packed auditorium at an educational technology conference in London. At 12, she had grown slightly taller, her confidence even more evident as she presented the latest advancements in EduEmpowerment's adaptive learning platform. "The past year has taught us something remarkable," she told the audience. "The same neural adaptive methodologies that help students learn academic content more effectively can also help adults recognize and address patterns of bias in professional contexts." On the presentation screen behind her, data visualizations displayed the impressive results from the airline training program that had grown from the Flight 789 incident, now expanded to 3 major carriers and being adapted for implementation in hotel chains, retail environments, and healthcare settings. When we personalize the learning experience, whether for a third grader mastering fractions or a flight attendant navigating complex passenger interactions, we create pathways for more durable and meaningful change. Zara explained, "It's not about generic sensitivity training or one-size-fits-all approaches. It's about recognizing that meaningful learning is always individual, always specific to how each person processes and retains information." In the audience, Solomon Reynolds watched his daughter with quiet pride, struck by how she had transformed a painful personal experience into a catalyst for innovation that was now benefiting thousands. Beside him sat Elena Garcia, who had become Zara's mentor and collaborator over the past year, helping guide the expansion of edu-empowerment from educational settings into corporate training environments. As Zara fielded questions from the audience, Solomon reflected on the many unexpected developments that had followed from that difficult day on Flight 789. The airline industry, facing increased scrutiny about bias in customer interactions, had embraced the Reynolds-developed training program as a way to address structural issues rather than just manage public relations crises. Richard Whitfield, after his initial contrition, had become an unexpected advocate for corporate accountability, speaking candidly about his own journey of recognizing ingrained biases. Most significant to Solomon, however, was Zara's continued growth, not just as a technological innovator, but as a young woman developing a nuanced understanding of how to navigate and gradually transform spaces that weren't designed with people like her in mind. After the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, Solomon and Elena joined Zara backstage. "Brilliant as always," Sparrow Solomon said, embracing his daughter. "Mum would have been so proud." "The audience was completely engaged," Elena added, "and I counted representatives from at least 17 different countries. The global expansion is happening even faster than we projected." As they made their way toward the exit, a young black girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, approached Zara, hesitantly clutching a conference program. "Excuse me, Miss Reynolds," she said shyly. "I saw your presentation. I'm working on a coding project for school and—" "Well, I wondered if you had any advice," Solomon watched, as Zara's expression brightened with genuine interest. She knelt slightly to be at eye level with the younger girl. "What's your name, and what kind of project are you building?" "Maya," the girl replied, her confidence growing as Zara engaged with her seriously. "I'm creating a game that teaches environmental science concepts, but I'm struggling with how to make the difficulty levels adapt to different players." "That sounds fascinating," Zara said with genuine enthusiasm. "Adaptive difficulty is exactly what my first projects focused on. Do you have a few minutes? I'd be happy to talk through some approaches that might help." As Zara and Maya settled onto a nearby bench, deeply engaged in technical discussion about neural adaptive approaches to game design, Solomon felt a profound sense of the journey coming full circle. Just over a year ago, Zara had been the young girl facing dismissal and discrimination in a space where she had every right to be. Now she was creating a different kind of space, one where another young innovator of color could be welcomed, engaged with seriously, and supported in her aspirations. "She's quite something," your daughter Elena observed quietly. "She always has been," Solomon agreed. "But this past year has shown me dimensions of her strength I hadn't fully appreciated before." As they waited for Zara to finish her impromptu mentoring session, Solomon found himself reflecting on the broader implications of what had grown from that difficult day on Flight 789. The incident had been painful, unnecessary, and all too representative of the challenges faced by people of color in spaces where their presence was automatically questioned rather than accepted. But the response, both individual and institutional, had created ripples of change that extended far beyond that single flight or passenger. The airline's training program, the corporate accountability initiatives, Zara's expanded platform for her technological innovations, and perhaps most meaningfully, moments like this one with young Maya, all represented different facets of progress toward more equitable spaces. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Discrimination hadn't disappeared from airlines or other public spaces. Many travelers without Solomon's influence or resources still faced similar treatment without recourse or remedy. The work of creating truly equitable systems remained ongoing and incomplete. But watching his daughter engage earnestly with a younger version of herself, creating the kind of welcoming space she herself had once been, denied, Solomon felt a measure of hope for the ongoing journey. Progress came not just through dramatic confrontations that went viral, but through countless small moments of recognition, support, and inclusion that gradually reshaped expectations about who belonged where. As Zara concluded her conversation with Maya, providing her email for future questions and encouraging her coding aspirations, Solomon saw in his daughter's genuine engagement the most meaningful legacy of their experience, not just addressing past wrongs, but actively creating spaces where future innovators could thrive without having to first prove their right to exist in those spaces at all. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a meaningful milestone along a path toward a world where first-class seats and all the other spaces where excellence and innovation happened would be places where young brilliance in all its diverse forms could be recognized, welcomed, and celebrated for exactly what it was. If this story about dignity, resilience, and transformation moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination in spaces where everyone deserves equal respect? What small actions can we each take to create more inclusive environments in our daily lives? Remember that change happens both through viral moments that capture public attention and through the countless daily choices we each make about how we recognize and respect others. By subscribing to Unheard Truth Stories, you're helping amplify voices that need to be heard and stories that need to be told. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where we continue to spotlight powerful journeys of courage, dignity, and justice.